I just want to say if the constant topic switching gets hard for anyone, you could tell me and I could try to slow the roll of it a little bit because this is like the pivot every hour it's a lot. It's a lot for the brain. So we are going to talk about the Universal Service Fund now, which I think when we were hearing about the budget, we heard about some funds with overages and some funds that's rapidly depleting. I think the Universal Service Fund is a rapidly depleting fund that Dan Dickerson's going to talk us through. Welcome to our committee for the first time. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. For those of you that I've not met before, Dan Dickerson with Joint Fiscal. I cover a wide smattering of policy areas. You'll probably see me in here randomly throughout the session. But one area that I have covered in the past and I'm here to talk about today is the Universal Service Fund. So I have prepared a PowerPoint that's sort of just a really high level overview of what the fund is, what revenues go into the fund, what programs the fund supports, and just sort of a general picture of what the trend has been as far as money's going in, money's going back out. And so if everybody has it up or printed, I will dive right in. So yeah, as far as the contents of the presentation, I'm going to talk about the Universal Service Charge, the Universal Service Fund itself, some of the programs that are supported by that fund, and then give you a general picture of revenues, expenses, and then a few, from my perspective, takeaways as you sort of continue your work throughout the session. I think important things to remember. So the Universal Service Charge. This charge was created in 1994. It resides in 30 VSA Chapter 18, and this charge was intended to increase telecommunications access for Vermont households. Who pays this charge? If you have a landline, a cell phone line, a cable package, you're paying the Universal Service Charge. I believe that's correct. If you are paying just for internet, you are not paying that charge. So this is a charge that's imposed on all retail telecommunications service provided to a Vermont address. This piece is important. If let's say I reside in New York and I cross the border into Bennington to buy a new cell phone and a new cell phone plan in Bennington, I should not be charged that because I reside in Vermont or in New York. I would, if New York has its own charge, then I would be charged that, but I would not be charged the Vermont Universal Service Charge. Because I live here in Montpelier, when I go to the Verizon dealership on Route 302, I pay that charge when I start my cell phone line. And then as of January 1st, 2020, for those people buying prepaid wireless telecommunication services, I believe these are phone cards that give you minutes on your electronic device. When that sales and use charge kicks in, it also kicks in the Universal Service Charge. So that's brought in a little bit more revenue. The current charge is 2.4%, but if you were to read in statute, it's broken up into two pieces. So that 2% is going to the Universal Service Fund, and then that 0.4% as of the most recent fiscal year, FY22, is going to the Vermont Community Broadband Fund. Previously, it was going to what's called the Connectivity Fund, but both the Connectivity Fund and the Broadband Fund have the same intended purpose, which is to expand broadband access throughout the state. So it's just that 0.4% is just going to a different fund with the same purpose. Any questions so far? Okay. So now I'm going to, oh, yes.
And that's like a waterfall, right? Or maybe you haven't gotten to the.
Oh, as far as, yes, that is a waterfall, but I will get to that. So now I'm going to jump into the Universal Service Fund. So this was also created in 1994. An important point here is the Universal Service Fund is managed by a fiscal agent, which currently is Solix. It is not managed by the state. So those dollars When they're remitted by telecommunications carriers, they go to this fiscal agent that manages funds. Some of those funds flow back to the state, and I'll get into that for some of the programs that the state directly supports. But the Universal Service Fund itself is managed by an outside entity. And I believe the Department of Public Service is the agency that contracts with this entity. So they would put out the requests for bids periodically. I don't know how often that is, but.
Do you have any idea why we do that?
That's a good question. I don't. But I know that's been the case going back to when it was created. Maybe that was just to sort of keep the politics out. I don't know. That's speculation on my part, but it does. I will say in trying to do research for this presentation, it makes it trickier because I'm reliant on external audit statements that are provided on the Public Service Department website, but I can't dig into the state's accounting system to see the flow of revenues and fluctuations. It's sort of this year by year outlook. There are a few, I would say there are a few question marks to some numbers that I'll provide later, but I'll explain those when I get to them. So the primary revenue source for the Universal Service Fund is the charge. And after paying the fiscal agent, as you noted, there are a tiered series of uses for the fund proceeds, the most important of which is paying the person that's managing the fund. So Solix gets their cut right off the bat. And then going down, the Vermont Telecommunications Relay Service, the Lifeline Program, Enhanced 911, and the Connectivity Fund, Connectivity Initiative get there.
What is the Vermont Telecommunications Relay Service?
I am going to go into that next.
Oh, great. Sorry.
So programs supported by the Universal Service Fund, first being the Telecommunications Relay Service. So this is a free service for all Vermonters to connect individuals who are deaf, deafblind, hard of hearing, or have a speech disability to users of standard telephones. And this is one of those instances where the Solix, the fiscal agent, sends some proceeds from the Universal Service Fund back to the state, who contracts with Sprint to provide this service. So it's a weird flow of funds, but the state does touch the dollars for this program before they go out to the administrator. There is a site that you can go to, I believe, for this that isn't extremely helpful, but if you're curious to know a little bit more information, you might be able to find it there. And a part of the telecommunications relay service is the Vermont Equipment Distribution Program. So this is where if you're a low-income household that has one of the issues above, or has one of the challenges above, then you can apply to receive equipment to help you connect with other individuals. The next is the Lifeline Program. This is a federal program to assist low-income customers with communication services. So the federal program, through the federal program, you can potentially receive discounts on telephone service, internet service, or bundled packages from participating providers. And then the state has its own program that sort of piggybacks on the federal one, but the state program only covers telephone service, or provides discounts for telephone service. And this is a program, I believe, that Solix independently contracts with somebody else to provide. So the state, I believe the state doesn't see or doesn't pass through these dollars to anyone. The next program, the big one, is Enhanced 911. So this is the system that if you make a call to 911, it can detect where you're located and the identity of the caller if you have a phone number assigned to you. This is managed by the Enhanced 911 board, and they have staff. This is the largest annual expenditure of Universal Service Fund dollars. So this is one of those instances where the fiscal agent takes some of those Universal Service Fund proceeds and ships them back to the state, to the E911 board. And so the E911 board goes to the Appropriations Committee and asks for its appropriations annually, most of which are funds from the Universal Service Fund. And important note here is that the revenues, the dollars that are flowing from the Universal Service Fund to the Enhanced 911 Fund have not been sufficient to fully fund E911 in recent years. I think they've cut the budgets quite a bit to address that funding issue. But I do know that last year in the big bill, Act 185, the E911 board, there was a transfer from the general fund to the E911 special fund of about 1.3 million to address a 2-year deficit. So I think that might be enough to get it through another year, but without some sort of change in how they're funded, most likely that special fund would be in deficit again, if not at the end of this year, probably at the end of next year. And then the last piece of what's funded through the Universal Service Fund tiered priorities is the Connectivity Initiative and the High Cost Program, which you might hear them treated as one program and really they are. I mean, it's really aimed at expanding broadband access for households. Connectivity, though, is more broad, and that is just intended to help get people connected to adequate service, whereas the high cost program is really meant to address those households that are just really inaccessible and expensive to expand services to. The Connectivity Initiative and High Cost Program, as far as the funding they receive, it's sort of at the discretion of Solix, the fiscal agent, as to whether those programs receive funding based on whether there's money left when everything else is funded.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but that 0.4% that we added last session is an exception to that, or not? We increased from the 2% to the 2.4%, and I think that 0.4% is specifically for the VCBD for a person and not subject to that waterfall.
Yes, that 0.4% is going to the broadband fund, which is basically is overseeing the connectivity initiative. So yes, you're right. But it is possible, I guess, as far as what's in the Universal Service Fund, the fiscal agent could see fit to send additional money if there's excess at the end of the year.
Somehow the trends were different.
Yeah. Let's see. Okay. So now I'm going to just dive into sort of a 10-year look back of the revenues, but I've got a little explanatory slide. So prior to state fiscal year 2015, the universal service charge rate was set by the Public Service Board through a docket, and those rates, at least in the 3 years that are captured in my look back, were 1.6, 1.82, and 1.8. And then starting in FY15, it went to 2%, stayed at 2% until FY20, when it went to 2.4. So for 2 years, that 0.4% was intended to go to the connectivity fund. And this is one area where looking at the audit statements is somewhat frustrating for me because I can't see where that movement of money happened. My understanding is that 0.4% went to the fiscal agent who should have sent it to the connectivity fund, but it's not immediately apparent to me from those audit statements that that was what happened. So it's something that I'm going to do more research on, but on my chart, it is going to show that I think those funds went to connectivity as stated. It's difficult to read those audit statements. I'll just say that.
I'm sure someone would tell us if that money wasn't making it to them.
Yeah, I think that's the case. Yeah, I think it's a peculiarity with those statements that makes them difficult for me to read. And then the other, as far as the revenues, the other important piece to this is that prepaid wireless transactions were now subject to the universal service charge as of January 1 of 2020. So about half of fiscal year 20 would have seen those additional revenues coming in, and then FY 21 would have been a full year, and 22. So the first chart that I have here is just a 10-year look at the revenues. You know, a majority of this is the universal service charge. I call that base, and that's just it's everything that the charge is applied to other than that prepaid wireless, which began in FY 20. In the early years of this 10-year look back, there was this performance assurance plan penalty, and my best explanation is this was a penalty that applied to when, let's say, one telecom provider absorbed another telecom provider and the service changed. If the overall service went down, then that new sort of bigger entity owed a penalty to the state because the service decreased.
And does that not exist anymore, or have we not?
It might still exist. There just hasn't been an instance of an entity being forced to pay that, but I can research that further. Okay. So then the next page, it's the same chart, except I've made notes where there were changes to the revenues. So in 2015, the charge went to 2% from that 1.8, and those prior 2 years, that was when the rate was determined annually by a docket rather than set in statute. In FY20, the rate went from 2 to 2.4%, and also that prepaid wireless started flowing in. And then in FY22, a part of the reason for the big drop here is that 0.4% is now going to the community broadband fund. And so the fiscal agent is not touching those dollars. That money is now going to the state to be managed in that broadband fund. So one thing that's not captured here that I think Maria helped me catch at the last minute is that because that 0.4% is no longer going through the fiscal agent and being reported in those audit statements, there's about $750,000 of additional revenue that would be included in FY22 to get total revenues to about 6 million. So right now it looks like about 5 million, so it'd be about 5.8 million. So it's not captured here just because I was pulling numbers directly off those audit statements when in reality there's this additional piece that the state is now collecting.
The lighter orange for the tower rental, my eyes aren't pulling. Oh, I did a good zoom and now I can see it. Okay, it's a very small.
Yes, there is a little bit of that over the past couple of years. I believe that started in 20, and then there's a little bit more in 21.
Thank you.
But yeah, that should have been a different color. I apologize.
It's okay. That is why.
And so on the next page here, slide 14, it's the same information, just with the numbers. And so just another note for 22, I think it's about, there'd be an additional 750. I want to say I made a note of that somewhere. I believe about 758,000 that is not included. Yeah, 758,000. So it's for FY '22, it's 4.2 million from the universal service charge that's applied to telecommunications other than prepaid, and then there's the 747 on prepaid, and this is all the 2%. And then there's 28,000 for tower rental, 2,000 for other, which I think is just interest, and I think some carrier or some telecommunications providers pay penalties if they don't pay the fiscal agent promptly. And then that 758,000 from the 0.4% that's going to the broadband fund. So the total would be about roughly 5.8 million. And then on page 15, it's the same chart again, except with the trend line of what expenses are. And so for 17 and 18, the reason that expenses were so much higher, they would have been higher than revenues anyway, but because there was a balance in the universal service fund, and this will be shown a little bit later on, that was sent over to, it was expended on the connectivity initiative. So it was a balance from prior years that was expended in 17 and 18. So that's why those big bumps in spending. So now diving into expenses. As I noted previously, E911 is the biggest piece of what the Universal Service Fund supports. Admin costs and the telecom relay service costs have been relatively stable. The Lifeline expenses have declined over time. I don't know at this point whether that's just due to a general decrease in demand or if it's just out of necessity because the revenues going to the Universal Service Fund have been slowly declining. So that's something I would like to have had an answer for you today, but I don't, that I'll continue researching. And then as far as what's gone to the connectivity fund, although now the broadband fund, those transfers have been sporadic just because, previously it fell so low on the, I guess, the totem pole, so to speak. But there were a couple of big transfers in FY 17 and 18 of excess Universal Service Fund balances from prior years. But now the Community Broadband Fund, which has taken over the Connectivity Initiative, is getting a dedicated piece of that Universal Service Charge, that 0.4%. So it's same general format on these tables, but just showing expenses now instead of the revenues. So like I said, admin costs, you see at the very bottom of these charts,
We can fly through the expenses side.
Okay. Trying to think if there's anything to note for you guys here. Yeah, probably not. Okay. Well, you've got the expenses here. Like I said, if you just go to the table with the numbers, admin costs have been relatively stable around 100, 110,000. The telecom relay, other than last year when it really went down a lot, has been relatively stable as well. But you can see Lifeline in 2013 was funded at 85,000, now down to 150,000. E911 has sort of gone up and down over time, but the past few years have gone down quite a bit. And I think just because there's no, other than what's coming from the Universal Service Fund, and then if they get a one-time general fund appropriation, there's not a whole lot for them to utilize. So I think those expenditures have gone down out of necessity. And then connectivity, so if you go to the other column, this 832,022, that's the money that's going to the broadband fund now. So that should really be in the connectivity column because it's for the same purpose, but I forgot to move it.
Yeah. Does the column that includes administrative costs, are those lumped together as between both the vendor who manages the fund, the private contract, but also the public employees who manage the various programs? That's all lumped in, called administrative costs?
No, the administrative is just for the outside entities that are overseeing this. So that's money for Solix, who manages the fund, and then money for the auditors who do the external audit. And then there's one other piece. There were three pieces, but it's not for state staff.
Okay.
I apologize for not remembering. Was it interest? No, it wasn't interest.
It just struck me as odd. I don't know anybody else. I thought the treasurer very fundamentally had charge of all state revenue.
It's fairly strange.
It's sort of puzzling. It's like privatizing it as part of the tax department. I don't get it.
Yeah, this is a really odd fund because it's not a state fund. I mean, we've created it in statute, but we've directed some outside entity to oversee it, and it's
Okay.
it's
If
peculiar.
you can create it by statute, it's state money.
I think we're having this conversation
Yeah.
because of the rapidly depleting nature of the fund and some possible fixes to it, but I had no idea it also had this very strange administrative part. So maybe we, in a future conversation, want to dive into that too, because it is quite peculiar, yes.
And not to take us too far down the rabbit
Yeah.
hole, but do the administrative costs, to your knowledge, represent all the money that goes to the fiscal agent?
Yes, all the money for what they do for their task of overseeing the Universal Service Fund. Yes, to my knowledge, that's all they're getting. And so the final slide is just, as I was thinking about, okay, I've got all these, random slides here. What are things that you should think about? And one, I think you've all caught on is it's managed by this fiscal agent, which is just a really weird way of managing this. And then the universal service charge revenues have been in a general decline. I think what's interesting about 22 is they did, when you count the piece that's not in those, that I didn't capture because they're not in those audit statements, they did sort of pop back up to about 6 million. So it'll be interesting to see how FY23 shapes up, if it sort of stays stable or if it sort of continues that long-term decline.
Representative Sim?
Yeah, I mean, I think just want to clarify, as we think about trying to solve the declining revenue for E911, to clarify that I think the intent of that 0.4% is specifically for broadband. And so while it certainly does raise up the fund, I don't think at least the current intent is to have that solve the E911 issue.
Yeah, there are two parallel challenges here. One is to the Universal Service Fund, which does assist, in a big way, the E911 fund, but also has these other sort of programs that fall under it. But then there's E911 itself, which is reliant on universal service that's in, I think, probably a lot more trouble fiscally than the Universal Service Fund, and how to support that beyond this universal service charge. So it is. And I would have, I think if I'd been focused on sort of the two pieces together, there probably could have been more to this presentation, more analysis of E911 alone, which I could do because I can look at that information in the state accounting system because it's a state fund. And I can come back and have a conversation about that another time. But you can see here that, E911 is not getting sufficient transfers from the Universal Service Fund to fully support the needs of Vermonters. And so, I once again pointed out that 1.3 million of general fund that was transferred last year. And then And I did want to point out the bright spot, which is, thanks to all of the federal funding we've received, there is a little bit less pressure on the connectivity initiative and the high cost program because we have this huge pot of federal money that we're able to dip into. So one less thing, it's one thing that we don't have to worry as much about supporting through the Universal Service Fund, I guess I would say. But that's my high level overview of universal service. And like I said, I'm happy to come back another time to talk a little bit more about E911. I think Maria's got some information for you on that today.
Just on one of your takeaways here, around the sort of decline in revenue, folks dropping cable and landline service. My understanding, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, is that
Can you speak up a little bit?
as folks cut their cord, then maybe the number of phone lines in Vermont isn't changing, or the number of voice lines are not changing. The number of corded lines are changing, and that as folks move to mobile carriers, maybe there's more flexibility for companies to consider the majority of your phone bill for data, and therefore the universal service fee doesn't apply. And so while the number of voice lines in Vermont is steady, the ability to collect revenue on the Universal Service Fund fee has diminished as folks just change, who they're paying for their voice service.
Yeah, and that's actually a piece that I hadn't captured, but Maria was nice enough to call out for me is here, where I've said bundling services, essentially exactly what you people are shifting their use from voice to data, which means that you can't apply the universal service charge because it falls under that sort of internet preemption issue that I don't completely understand, but we can't. I do know that we can't apply the charge to internet because of
Well, it does seem like
federal law.
a handful of other states, have looked at alternative models that look at per line fee as opposed to a percent fee. And it sounds like we'll hear more about that. And remember that this idea came forward at the end of the session, last year, and there kind of wasn't time to dig into it, but we have maybe more time now.
Maslin, okay.
Yeah, Dan, if the fund wasn't managed by an outside entity, who would do it? Treasury? And would it be more fiscally advantageous for Vermont and the things we service if we didn't hire out that service? Or would it be, would Treasury say, nah, we don't want it? That's several questions here. Relative expense. And then the other one, I guess, is for like a check or something like that, but I'm just curious, how much do we pay?
I think possibly, possibly the tax department, possibly public service department, although I don't think public service is in the, I don't know if they have the capacity or the know-how in-house to sort of manage a tax or a charge or a fee. Well, I guess they do have some fees, so they might be able to do that, but I think most likely tax would be. But as far as cost.
Why don't we give you some time to
Yeah, that's.
question instead of talking
This
about
question just is how much do we pay? Is it,
Yeah, I know, I think.
Give it some thought and then let us know, because we can have a whole conversation around the governance of it.
Yeah.
I'll wait.
Okay,
Yeah, Craig Bolio is probably going to come in here and like ring my.
he will not. He will not do that, not while you're in this room. Thank you so much for talking us through the downward slope of the fund and how that's been shaped. I think Maria has some sort of context to share with us. And then there was sort of a really straightforward fix that came up at the end of last session that I want to just carry into this session. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Maria Royal with Legislative Council. And since we're doing general introductions, I cover a broad range of subjects. I do utilities, including telecommunications. I also do broadband, property and casualty insurance. You'll see me on the DFR housekeeping bill with the captive insurance bill and banking and securities. So you'll probably see me on a number of things. But today, Dan did a great job providing an overview of the fund and some of the unfortunate aspects, including the declining revenue and inability to fully fund the programs it was designed to fund. So I'm going to just briefly recap, I think, what was already stated, and then we're going to look at the proposal that was considered in a couple of committees last year at the end of the session. That's posted online under my name. If you want to pull up the draft language, eventually we'll go through that. But as Dan mentioned, the 2.4% raises just under $6 million a year. It's been declining. The revenue has been declining at about 5% a year since 2015. So this has been a problem on the radar for a little while. And as was already stated, that is initially because people were dropping their landlines. If they had really great cell phone coverage, they decided maybe we don't need to pay for a landline. Right now, the number of lines in service is pretty stable, but as Representative Sims mentioned, about 82% of voice service is now provided through mobile and VoIP. And those are the providers that generally offer data and voice services. And on your bill, if you have mobile or a VoIP service, the amount of money that's specifically allocated for your voice service has gone down and down and down. It's a very small percentage of your bill. Hence the declining accessible revenue, because we can't tax broadband data. That's non-accessible revenue that's in proportion growing. So that's kind of the problem. And because of this, you, the legislature, and more specifically, because 911, since it's kind of at the bottom of the waterfall, has not been fully funded through this Universal Service Fund, you requested that the Agency of Administration look at alternatives for stabilizing the fund and coming up with a funding mechanism that makes 911 more sustainable on an ongoing basis. So the agency submitted a report last year, I think in January of last year, and they looked at a couple of proposals, one of which I'm going to go over with you, but I just wanted to clarify that they didn't actually recommend the change that I'm going to go over, which is changing the contribution method. They actually thought that E911, and they could speak for themselves, but I just wanted to not make it look like they were recommending this one. In fact, on the record, they said they weren't. So, but they actually thought that 911 should be a general fund program. So, I just wanted to be clear about that. So anyway, one of the proposals though that they did look at was changing the 2.4% fee to a flat monthly 70-cent fee per voice line in service. So instead of paying a percentage of your voice bill, if you have a line in service, you would pay 70 cents a month. So if you're paying $30 a month for voice service, you're pretty much going to break even. If you're paying less than that amount, then you might have to pay a little bit more. If you're paying more than that, then you might be paying a little bit less. But part of the reason why they suggested that, again, is because the number of lines in service are relatively stable. They estimated that amount, and they actually had a list of if it were 60 cents, you'd raise this much. So 70 cents on per voice subscription would raise about $7.4 million. So right now the fund is just under 6 million. An additional $1.5 million, it would fully fund the programs based on their current budgets. So I should also just clarify that, you know how Dan explained that there was a 0.4% increase that went just to broadband? Under the proposal, the 0.4%, about a sixth of the fund, 17% of whatever money is generated would still go to broadband. So you're leaving that funding stream essentially alone. And one more thing I wanted to mention is there's also a carve out for prepaid wireless. These were the cards that Dan mentioned. If you buy a card for voice service, if you go into a retail outlet, a convenience store, Walmart, whatever, and you buy a card with an access code that enables you to make a certain number of minutes of calls per month, those would be exempted under the proposal we're about to go over. They would still be subject to a 2.4% charge. Right now, they're subject to that charge, and that's collected at point of sale, just like the sales tax. So part of the thinking there was some people buy a card that's maybe only worth $10, putting a 70-cent fee on a $10 card maybe doesn't make so much sense. Administratively, they'd also have to update their software to change the amount. But so just wanted to let you know that funding stream would stay the same for prepaid wireless. Everybody else, all the other voice carriers would impose a 70-cent charge. So if we want to quickly look at the draft, I don't think this will take very long at all because I think it says pretty much what I just stated. And then I'll answer any questions, but also go over some of the issues that were raised last year that were not fully fleshed out, but things maybe just for your consideration to be aware of. So if you're looking at the draft, section 1 is just striking out the reference to a proportional charge because it's no longer proportional, at least not in all instances. Section 2 is where it states for the rate of charge, except for prepaid wireless, which is going to remain the same. The rate of charge shall be 70 cents for each retail telecommunications service line capable of accessing the 911 system. Subsection B on line 22 of that page, you'll see at the very last line, from the monies collected, 17%. This is the earmark for broadband. So that's going to continue to go to the Vermont Community Broadband Fund. Then just going down to section 3, it's just the specific statutory change to say that the 2.4 remains the same for prepaid wireless. And that is pretty much it. This would take effect on September of this year. So in terms of some of the issues that were raised that were not kind of fully developed, too, and do you have questions at this point? Anything?
Yeah, Representative.
I just wanted to ask, was there any thought to sunsetting when the Vermont Community Broadband Fund would stop receiving that 17% by a certain date or a certain amount of broadband?
That I have not heard. However, the fund itself and the board sunset in 2029.
I didn't know that. We better finish by then. We're gonna be done. I like that. Okay. Did you have something? I'm sorry.
Just, a clarification of voice service, regardless of whether it is through the ether by a mobile phone or whether it's on a coaxial cable. And then you run in presumably the same auditing problem of having to trust the provider's division. Or is there some other mechanism by which you can discriminate between numbers and letters of the alphabet?
It's really up to the providers
Okay,
how they
thanks.
want to bill.
It's a problem no matter.
It's how they bill. And so if you look at your phone bill, you'll see for your voice.
It says
service,
unlimited, and the question is, how
Yeah,
do you proportion what's unlimited?
what's data and what's voice.
Yeah,
And they,
okay.
And this way we don't have to anymore.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Representative.
you remember that there's in fact, a form that telecommunications providers actually report the number of lines on.
Yep, so that's a good point. So all of this data, the number of lines in service in Vermont, all of the providers submit Form 477 to the FCC. And then the state doesn't have access to all of the detailed information, but the FCC sends back in aggregate how many voice subscriptions there are in the state by provider type. So we know how many wireline, traditional wireline, how many mobile, how many VoIP. So that's how we can tell that about 82% of voice services now are mobile or VoIP. Mobile is the biggest, about almost 70% of voice services are provided by mobile carriers. So issues in this draft are things for your consideration. A couple of things that did come up. One was, what do you do for households that have multiple lines? You charge everybody at 70 cents for every line in service in a household. Some states that have this kind of a connection charge charge the full amount for the first line in service and then a decreasing amount for every additional line in service. Similarly, for large entities, schools, hotels, hospitals, large businesses that have many lines, legislature, if you charge 70 cents for each line, that's going to might be a very big impact on their budget that they're not anticipating. Some states have imposed a cap of like 25 lines in service. Anything above that, you pay only up to 25. The other thing, and this is more depending on the budgets and the needs going forward, the revenue requirements. Some states have allowed their equivalent of the PUC to adjust the connection fee as needed to reflect any revenue requirements that are needed. That's something that you could consider. Indexing the fund maybe to inflation or whatever is an appropriate index. Or just having the legislature and the fee bill or whatever annually looking at the issue. And that's pretty much it. The only, there was one comment raised about particularly the lower income, the Lifeline subscribers who, I think one provider said that their monthly fee with the discounts might be about $15 a month. So they're paying about 36 cents a month under the 2.4 charge, that they go up to 70 cents. So they're about 10,000, just under 10,000 Lifeline subscribers in Vermont. And that's pretty much it.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. I think right now we're like, I am just tossing a lot of balls up into the air for everyone, and then we'll see which balls land where. But wondering if folks have, questions, thoughts as we move forward on this particular ball and problem. Yeah.
I just, having participated in the last biennium inconclusively of settling the disagreement about dispatch services in the state of Vermont, I'm wondering about the intersection.
Yeah.
And I don't want to presume and drag us off point, but there's got to be people at the other end of that phone line.
Yes. So the dispatch conversation is one that the government operations and governance side of needs to be figured out before we can tackle the revenue side of, and how municipalities might or might not participate in the revenue side of that. And so I think both Government Operations Committee and the House and Senate are already taking testimony on that conversation, and we will eventually
So it won't affect.
get the fruit of their labors. Yeah, this is sort of a parallel to that.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think one of the challenges and one of the reasons that previous bodies have stayed away from this conversation is it's very, very hard to separate the conversation about the fund and the depleting funds from all of the various things it funds. And so this is an attempt to do a little bit of separating so we can maybe weave our way through the conversation without our brains exploding.
Yeah, I like appreciate the simplicity of like, we have a declining funds that doesn't align with the immediate needs right now. There is, it seems to me like a pretty straightforward solution to just solve that misalignment. And then we can have those much bigger conversations. But this seems like a pretty simple fix around one issue.
I like the fact that we don't have to now fret about auditing either, because this is getting more opaque as we discover.
I also like the, I think sometimes we struggle to legislate for the future. So like a revenue source becomes, like technology changes and we don't necessarily catch up with it in our fee schedule. You know, like when we looked at meal delivery services last year, it's like we were a little bit behind the ball on figuring out like, oh wait, what does this even mean for our tax code? And this is just sort of one of those pieces of technology that we haven't quite caught up with our tax code. Thank you very much. Maureen.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
Abby will be here
She's coming right now.
in a moment, so we're just gonna sit here and we're gonna stay live.
The latest document has been uploaded.
Great.
So it's called Memo 2 Appropriations rather than from.
And I'm hoping that we can give this all a straw poll thumbs up today if it looks that way. And send it on over.
Table.
It is the table. Yes.
All right, maybe I'm not seeing it.
Refresh.
I did.
I did.
It's under Abby's name.
I don't see.
No, it's under committee. It's under committee, sorry.
Okay,
And it says budget adjustment memo to House appropriations.
thank you.
And Abby, when you have caught your breath, we'd love for you to be there, but really you can catch your breath first. Thank you. Yes.
Sorry, there's that extra little run over here from the pink lady that takes me longer than everyone else to get into the building. Sorry, I'm just looking on my committee webpage. I'll just use my Word doc. Okay. So for the record, Abby Shepherd, Office of Legislative Counsel. I am using this chart format, which hopefully condenses everything, makes it a little quicker to cross-reference with the bill language. So starting with section 4, this is the reversions to both the general fund and the education fund balances. And I took notes on your discussion, which is in the final column, which states your position. So I can read those to you, or you can read them and let me know if you want to make any changes. I noted that you wish to that you suggested using a portion of the $10 million reversion to the general fund to fund the Community Action Partnerships VITA program, which is volunteer income tax assistance. I also noted that you are in conversations with the Department of Taxes. I'm not sure if it was that specific or with stakeholders as well.
You could say Department of Taxes and stakeholders, I guess.
Sure. Regarding ways to improve taxpayer uptake. So it's pretty broad. I just noted existing tax incentive programs. My understanding is you were referring to several of the line items there. So the renter credit, property tax credit, and multiple different tax programs there.
This last paragraph, the education fund.
Yes.
I don't think we're deferring on the uses of the education fund reversions. I think we're deferring to them on the scale
Okay.
of the reversions.
So not the suggested scale, but the scale of using the education fund reversions as opposed
No,
to.
not using. So I think we would be the ones who talked about using. I think it's just what that means for sort of the functioning of the Agency of Education, that there are reversions at all is something we're deferring on.
Okay. Do you still want to include, I noted the statute that talks about the sort of default that.
Yes, I would
reversions go to
name
line?
I think naming the default makes sense. And then just that we're deferring on the scale of the reversions.
To the Agency of Education, to the Education Committee for what's reverting to the agency.
Yes. Anyone have anything else on that first section 4? Okay. Section 14.
Section 14, I'm not sure if you did check in with my colleague Beth St. James on this, but my understanding is you did support using any, okay, so that's for the ESSER funds that hadn't been fully expended, that would authorize expending them to the full amount that they were granted by the federal government. Section 15, state teachers retirement system, changes, and I didn't note the amounts as
I think that
laid out.
is good.
Is that okay? Great. So in taking my notes, you said that the section appeared to be in line with actuarial adjustments that were expected from last session, hearing from Chris Roop. I didn't know if you wanted.
Nope, it's good.
Colette's JFO confirmed. Great. Section 26, this is the appropriation language to the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board for the CTE revolving loan fund. This is the notwithstanding.
Can you say the committee is in favor of the change and remains mindful of the use of notwithstanding? Thank you.
With regard to the education fund
Indeed,
in
yes.
particular?
The education fund in particular. Thank you.
Okay, I'll make that into a complete sentence. The section 30 in the Budget Adjustment Act was my colleague Ellen's. So she has provided draft language. There are 2 separate issues that are addressed at the very end, so not in chart form. I didn't know if you wanted to have Ellen speak to that or have me finish with what.
Why don't you finish and then we can.
Jumping to the final note here, I separated this out to make it clear that this is not currently in the Budget Adjustment Act. It is not one of the governor's recommendations. This would be new language that you've heard from my colleague Becky Wasserman about amending the tobacco products tax to exempt cannabis and hemp products that do not contain tobacco. If this weren't to be done, then those products would be subject to the other tobacco products tax, which is a 92% excise tax.
And we did a straw poll on this language last week.
And I just took wholesale what Becky had worked on. So it's if you had seen that language, that's what you would have seen last week.
So reading the downtown and village tax center credit language, does anyone have any questions that require chairs to shifted?
That require what?
That require Ellen and Abby to switch their seats.
Okay, so we got the last sentence clarifying there.
I'm okay.
Okay,
I'm okay with it.
Yeah, I think it's
Okay.
fine.
everyone okay?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you very much for the team effort on this memo and Abby for entering this is a new thing, these formal memos, so appreciate you helping with it.
Sure.
Yeah.
I made a few small changes, so I'll forward those to Sorsha.
Okay, thank you.
For you.
Great. Can we do a little straw poll, team? Okay,
Ready to go?
you can call the roll.
Andrews, yes. Anthony,
Yes.
Beck,
Yes.
Brannigan,
Yes.
Demrow,
Yes.
Maslin,
Yep.
Maddos absent, Odie,
Yes.
Sims,
Yes.
Taylor,
Yes.
Canfield,
Yes.
Kornheiser.
Yes.
11